In 859 AD, a Viking warlord sailed out of France with 62 ships and a plan. The plan was to sail to Rome, the greatest city in the world, the seat of the civilization that Vikings had been raiding for generations, and make himself its king. He never found Rome. He found North Africa instead, then southern Spain, then the south of France, then Italy, and somewhere in Italy he found a city he was absolutely certain was Rome, attacked it, conquered it, and discovered it was the wrong city entirely. His name was BJORN IRONSIDE, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, and this is the most extraordinary adventure story in the entire Viking Age, with a debate at the center of it that I want you to settle in the comments. Was this the greatest Viking raid in history? Or the most expensive wrong turn ever made? 62 ships set out, 20 came home. You decide. Let's establish what we actually know about BJORN IRONSIDE and where the legend takes over, because the distinction matters. The historical record mentions a powerful Viking chieftain called Berno. In contemporary Frankish sources from 855 and 858, a significant naval commander who conducted raids in West Francia. The saga tradition, written 2 to 4 centuries later, identifies this figure as BJORN IRONSIDE, son of Ragnar Lothbrok, and adds considerable color. His mother gave him magical invulnerability to wounds as a child, earning him the name Ironside. He would later become king of Sweden and found a dynasty. Some of this is likely true, some is certainly embellishment. What is beyond serious doubt is that someone led 62 Viking ships out of the Loire in 859 on the most geographically ambitious raid in the entire Viking Age. The chronicles argue about the details. They all agree that expedition happened. In 859, Bjorn and his co-commander Hastein departed their base on the Loire River in France with 62 ships. This was not a raiding party. This was an army designed for a long campaign across multiple seas. Their first target was the Iberian coast, but Galicia and Asturias proved too well defended, so they kept moving south. They crossed the Strait of Gibraltar, something no Viking fleet had ever done before, and entered the Mediterranean Sea. Then something changed. What had started as a raid looking for easy targets became something else entirely. They raided North Africa. They hit the Balearic Islands. They sacked the south of France and spent an entire winter camped on a river island in the Camargue. In the spring, they pushed up the Rhône River over 100 miles, sacking Nimes, Arles, and Valence. Then the Franks defeated them and pushed them back to the coast, and so they pointed their ships east, toward Italy, toward what they believed was Rome. Now we reach the most famous episode of the entire expedition, and the one where history and legend are most difficult to separate. Bjorn and Hastein arrived at a city on the northwest coast of Italy that they believed to be Rome. It was not Rome, it was Luni, a modest port town built on the ruins of a once prosperous Roman settlement. The walls of Luni were too strong to breach by direct assault, so Hastein devised a plan that would be retold across Europe for centuries. He sent messengers to the city's bishop with devastating news: Hastein was dying. He had converted to Christianity on his deathbed and wished to receive last rites and be buried on consecrated ground within the city's walls. The bishop, moved by this apparent Christian conversion, opened the gates. Hastein was carried inside on a funeral bier by his guard. Then he sat up, killed the bishop at the altar. His warriors at the gates drew their weapons, and Luni fell. Now, this story is almost certainly embellished. Historians describe it as apocryphal. The same trick is attributed to several later Norman leaders, which suggests it became a standard piece of legendary flattery added to powerful commanders. But whether it happened exactly this way or not, Luni was taken. That much is confirmed, and when they realized it was not Rome, Bjorn Ironside, according to the chronicles, was furious. Right here at the halfway through this story, I want to stop and ask you something, because this is genuinely a debate historians still argue about. Was Bjorn Ironside's Mediterranean expedition a triumph or a disaster? Here's the case for triumph. They went where no Viking fleet had ever gone. They raided North Africa, Spain, France, and Italy in a single campaign spanning 3 years. They came home with, as the chronicles record, gold, silver, and slaves enough to make everyone who survived extremely wealthy. The fake death trick at Luni, whether it happened exactly that way or not, became so famous it was copied by Norman leaders for centuries. Here's the case for disaster. 62 ships left, 20 came back. That is a loss rate of 67%. 2 out of every 3 ships were destroyed. The men on those ships were killed, captured, or drowned. They never found Rome. Their greatest victory was sacking the wrong city. So I want you to settle this in the comments right now. Greatest Viking raid in history or most expensive wrong turn ever made? I'll give you my answer at the end, but I want yours first. Getting into the Mediterranean was difficult. Getting out nearly killed them. The Strait of Gibraltar is only 9 miles wide. When Bjorn and Hostein's fleet turned for home in 861, the Moorish fleet of the Umayyad Emirate of Cordoba was waiting. They had been waiting for months. A strong surface current flows constantly through the strait from the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, which means ships trying to exit sail against it, moving slowly. The Moorish ships had something the Vikings had never faced: fire catapults. The chronicles record the Vikings losing approximately 40 ships, some to storms during the expedition, some to this ambush at the strait. What remained of the fleet made it through. They sailed north along the Iberian coast. They were ambushed again near Medina Sidonia and lost more ships to fire catapults. When the survivors finally made it back to French waters in 862, 3 years after they left, they had 20 ships. But those 20 ships, every chronicle agrees, were heavy with the richest plunder any Viking fleet had ever brought home. According to Norse saga tradition, and this is where we enter clearly legendary territory, Bjorn Ironside returned to Scandinavia and became King of Sweden. The Icelandic sagas identify him as the ancestor of the Munsur dynasty, the line of kings that ruled Sweden until approximately 1060 AD. Medieval sources mention his sons and grandsons by name, Erik Bjornsson and Bjorn at Haugi among them. In the early 18th century, a burial mound on the Swedish island of Munsur was identified by antiquarians as Bjorn Ironside's barrow, though this cannot be verified archaeologically. What can be said is that the Munsur dynasty was real. It ruled Sweden for generations, and the saga tradition consistently places Bjorn Ironside at its origin. He may or may not have been everything the sagas claim, but someone founded that dynasty, and the wealth from 62 ships' worth of Mediterranean plunder would have been exactly the kind of resource base that turns a war leader into a king. Here is the dark psychology question underneath all of this. Bjorn Ironside grew up as the son of the most famous Viking in the world, Ragnar Lothbrok, the man who raided Paris, who died defying a king, whose death launched the great heathen army. Ragnar's shadow would have fallen across every single thing Bjorn did for his entire life. So when Bjorn decided to sail to Rome, not raid England, not raid France, not do what Vikings did, but specifically sail to Rome, the greatest city in the world, to make himself its king, what was that really about? The evidence suggests a man trying to exceed his father's legend so completely that comparison becomes impossible. Ragnar raided France. Bjorn raided North Africa. Ragnar humiliated a Frankish king. Bjorn tried to conquer Rome. It didn't work. But the ambition itself, the scale of it, the refusal to stay in the lane his father defined, tells you everything about the psychology of a man born into a legend that would always threaten to be bigger than anything he could do himself. That is a story as old as fathers and sons. The Mediterranean was just Bjorn's way of fighting it. So, my answer to the debate I asked you to settle earlier: greatest raid or greatest disaster? My honest answer is both simultaneously, and that's what makes it extraordinary. 62 ships left, 20 returned. By any military metric, that is a catastrophic loss rate, but those 20 ships brought back wealth that funded a dynasty. The expedition opened the Strait of Gibraltar to Norse navigation for the first time in history. It demonstrated that Viking range extended not just across the North Sea and Atlantic, but across the entire Mediterranean world, from Scandinavia to North Africa in a single campaign. And the story of Hostin faking his own death to sack a city he thought was Rome became so famous that Norman leaders were still copying the trick 200 years later. Bjorn Ironside didn't conquer Rome, but he built a reputation that outlasted most people who did conquer things. That, I think, is the Viking answer to the question of whether he won or lost. He came home rich, alive, and legendary. In the Viking Age, that was winning. Subscribe to Powerlines, where power, history, and dark psychology meet. And drop your verdict in the comments, triumph or disaster. Because I have a feeling this one is going to split the room.